Hi, guys. We are moving on to the Italian Renaissance. So the Middle Ages are done. We have opened up trade. We have opened up expansion into new lands. We have the concept of being a nation. And now this idea of rebirth or Renaissance is going to come about. And it's going to start in Italy. We know Italy's always been on like kind of the beginnings of things because it's on the Mediterranean Sea and spreading easily with trade and ideas. And so it makes sense that this big Renaissance movement would begin there as well. Trade is going on now, like I mentioned. We are seeing less people with the end of the Middle Ages and the Crusades and the Black Death killing people. So now we have higher pay going on with individuals when they work. More goods were coming in, which meant though also prices were going down. Things like guilds had already disbanded, and we were able to increase trade with new goods. The Silk Road you learned about in sixth grade has reopened, and now the Chinese and the Romans did business together through this caravan routes and through the Mediterranean Sea. And in the next little mini unit, we'll talk about a particular conqueror who's pretty brutal, but will connect the Silk Road with Europe as well. Dynasties with China fell, and soldiers no longer protected the travelers. And the use of the Silk Road did decline for a period of time. But it's going to reopen with these Mongols that we'll get into more detail with later, and in a particular Italian merchant named Marco Polo. No, it's not just a game you play in the pool. He was a real person, and he traveled from Europe to China. The game kind of came from the concept for he was gone for long periods of time. No one knew where he was. They tried to send messages to him, Marco Polo, and all of a sudden now he was discovering these amazing things like new inventions like paper, money, and coal. Marco Polo met with Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, who he named him as a government official. Now, the Chinese weren't happy, one, to be invaded and conquered by the Mongols. They're very protective people. And now they're going to be ruled by a European, someone who's not themselves as well. He stayed for 20 years before going home. He recorded everything in a book that we will see later be very significant for travel and exploration. Many people wanted to see this new land and get these new things like coal and paper money and later things like gunpowder. So trade cities in Europe, 1300s, we had four major cities that are going to be known for big trade: Florence, Genoa, Milan, and Venice. They played important roles. They were on the ports of the Mediterranean, like Venice and Genoa, and they brought in goods by shipping. Also, they're going to manufacture things, meaning they're going to make them or specialize in certain crafts of making goods. Venice will be known for glass. You hear the word Venetian glass a lot. Milan workers made weapons and silk. Milan is still kind of a fashion headquarters, so we would see that as continuing from there. Florence was going to be known for their wool into yarn. Then in Florence, the wool industry was big money until something called banks opened. Well, how do banks make money? Banks loan people money, and you have to pay something called interest. So if I go to buy a house that's $100,000, I don't just pay $100,000 for it. I pay monthly fees, or maybe I put some down payment down, or my monthly mortgage, and that would allow the bank to make money off of my loan every month because I have to pay more than whatever that base payment would be to pay off the $100,000. So it's really crazy because it ends up that your $100,000 house almost ends up costing 200 and some thousand by the end of your loan because they're giving you 15, 30 years, whatnot, to be able to pay it off. The Medici family was one of the richest families in Florence, and they became what we call a patron, meaning they were sponsoring or paying for things. So banks was one thing they were starting to get up and running, and they were giving people loans, expanding business and trade. And he also wanted Florence to be a beautiful city again, go back to that Roman Empire of like architecture and beauty. So he decorated the palace and redid buildings. And he also would host events like for different famous artists. And he would have a gallery opening going on within his home. And then that was the only chance that really artists had a chance to earn money unless they were making things for the church. The Catholic Church did support the arts as well. So Europe at the beginning of the Renaissance looked like this. It wasn't really organized very much. We had some nations and lands, but we saw a lot of activity around still the Mediterranean. And then the Renaissance, like I mentioned, was that rebirth. They're going back to Roman and Greek art and literature. So we call those the classics when we're going back to Greek and Roman works. The city-states in Italy were also controlled by the Catholic Church. We still had that influence. So we'll see a lot of the art is very heavily religious in nature. Then the other thing we'll start to see develop is a lot of what we call self-portraits or portraits, meaning we either painted a picture of ourselves or we painted it of a person. And we're seeing more realism, more realistic things that we're going to see in the art than we've seen in the past. So they were kind of going beyond religion. So before we only learned about religion, we only wrote about religion. That was the only education in the Middle Ages. Now we're going to go back to that poetry, art, history, the Greek, Roman languages. And this is going to come through with a concept of humanism. It means we're stressing the importance of human abilities and actions. So we're not just saying you're a child of God, that's all you are only a thinker of religion. We're saying you have all of these characteristics. Your faith is still important. Your religion is still important. It's still part of you. But now you are, well, what else can you do other than just, be a child of God and be a laborer? What can you do? What are your artistic skills? Can you contribute? Francesco Petrarch is who studied and kind of was the first to put these Roman classics back into the European scene. And he started from discoveries of old writings and things that he had found that were important. The style of art is also going to be much more realistic, like I mentioned, like with the portraits. And we're going to develop something called perspective. Have you ever looked at a painting and you almost feel like if you move in different directions, the eyes of the person follow you, or you have different kinds of images that you see? So we don't see this really flat, one-dimensional idea. We're going to see this kind of 3D perspective come into play. And artists and architects are going to be very inspired by all that ancient Greek and Roman works. You probably recognize these guys, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? They have some cool names. Their names were not original. They were stolen from Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. Leonardo da Vinci, probably one of the most famous Renaissance thinkers, because with the Renaissance, you wouldn't be just a painter or just one kind of artist. You were really expansive. So he was a scholar, he studied, he read, he was a painter, an inventor, a map maker, an architect. So he would have all of these different kind of aspects that made him the great thinker he was. He made all these detailed drawings of technology and nature. They saw first developments of helicopters and different kinds of planes in his books that were found later on. He studied anatomy. His images of, a person kind of in a circular form, showing movement, that's like a kind of a symbol for medical knowledge now. But his most famous painting is the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. So here on the left is the Mona Lisa, probably one of the most famous paintings and recognizable in the world. Lots of little kind of quirky stories revolved because he never really gave the information of who she was. So there's all these kind of theorists that came out with different ideas. So is she his great love? Is she himself in female form? Is she his mother in her younger years? Portrayed? Is, it's just a stranger he picked up off the street? No one knows. Okay. This bottom right picture, the Last Supper, showing Jesus before his crucifixion, is probably one of the most famous religious paintings. If you'd be hard pressed to go to any religious Christian-based building or church and not see a representation or a poster or a replica of that painting. And that's John the Baptist being baptized in that imagery. The church was the only paying industry for art. So it was the only place you could usually sell your art for any kind of substantial money early on in the Renaissance. So that's why, again, we see a lot of religious content. Michelangelo designed buildings, wrote poetry, he carved sculptures and painted. He designed the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. The Vatican was the main area that the popes part of his church and his cathedral. And again, he loved those Greek and Roman styles. What was unique about Michelangelo's sculpture, there's his self-portrait, was when he did the Sistine Chapel, he did it for almost 7 years completely on his back because he had to paint the ceilings and these high areas. So they used a scaffolding system where he would actually lay on this top portion. There'd be a platform, and he would lay there on his back with his arm in the air, doing his different painting and all that detail. You can see this is not any kind of stick figures he's got going on there. It took him years. He wouldn't allow any of his assistants to do it. He took a great deal of time and energy with it. There were stories that he almost went insane from doing it. He got so involved in it. He had issues with his eyesight because of all the paint dripping and fumes in his eyes. So it was a pretty miraculous paintings, though, that he did. You can see the details of some of the stories here. You have Moses and different stories. Almost every major story from the Bible is represented in his paintings in the Sistine Chapel. Raphael's another great artist. He did many biblical images and great paintings. His self-portrait is very well known. And these little thinking angels, they became kind of like on posters and note cards and used in memes and stuff like that. Donatello was one of the greatest sculptors of all time, first in Europe to use marble and bronze. His David from the David and Goliath religious story, and his self-portrait is here, and that's St. Mark, a patron saint in the Catholic religion. So as this develops in the Renaissance, we're going to start to see kingdoms develop. We're going to start to see, this isn't the Roman Empire we knew of, but it was just kind of what was left over that hadn't been put into separate countries. And we're also going to eventually see the Renaissance move from Italy up into some of these northern regions. So the big idea is to remember, Renaissance means rebirth. What's it mean to rebirth? We're not really doing something brand new. We're bringing back something from the past. And that's where we get from the Greek and Roman works and those classics coming in. It starts Italy and will slowly spread to the rest of Europe through travel and trade. We see the reopening of the silk trade routes from the Silk Road. Humanism will stress the importance of human and their abilities. And Italian artists and writers will create new works that don't just focus on the religion. All right, next up, you're going to be answering a Google form just to review these concepts. On the post, I've posted this video. I've posted the slides that I am using through this video. And then the Google form will be a separate classwork assignment. Have the slides open for this PowerPoint while you are taking the Google form so you can look back and reference and get the best information for your answers. Okay, nice telling you about the Renaissance. Next, we will move on to the Reformation.